now with standards 5, 6, and 7. And if you are watching this straight through, of course I've taken some little breaks as I've recorded it, but if you're watching it straight through, you're probably getting a little fatigued. I'll just, in the way of encouragement, I will tell you that this says Part 3, and there are only 3 parts in the Code and Standards. We still have the stub material, but we are getting close to the end of this somewhat cumbersome Standards of Professional Conduct. I realize that slogging through that is somewhat difficult. Nonetheless, we are getting towards the end, so take heart. This will pass. All right, so what do we need to do? Well, we've still got several standards to get through, and the next one, of course, is Standard 5, Investment Analysis, Recommendations, and Actions. I think that this is one of the important ones. There are all things that you need to know, but this one contains some key information that we'll see as we go through. So let's just jump in and see what Standard 5A says, and this is dealing with diligence and reasonable basis. Now remember, my idea of the core structure of the ethics material is independence, loyalty, diligence, reasonable basis, then suitability, with the caveat of disclosure that'll come at the end in case there's a problem with some of these others. So in particular, the independence thing can be cured by disclosure. So diligence, reasonable basis, this is a big deal. What does it say? Well, it says to exercise diligence. That shouldn't be surprising to us. Diligence, independence, thoroughness in analyzing investments and in making investment recommendations and taking investment actions. So we have to be diligent and we have to be independent, we have to be thorough is what this says. And when we make decisions, we have to have an adequate basis supported by research. So if you're talking or you're reading a scenario on the exam and someone is an analyst and they've been following this industry and they have to go out and talk to a CEO, and a CEO says, oh, well, this other company, they're going to have their earnings fall in the next quarter, and then you, based on having this one conversation with one person who's knowledgeable in the industry, go out and make recommendations on that, well, that's not an adequate basis and it's not supported by research. Now, that may spur you to go out and investigate changing market shares and product shipments and all those types of things. There may be some underlying research principles that could be applied there, but just basing it on someone saying something is not going to be adequate. So we have to be diligent. We have to have a reasonable basis that is supported by research. Is what this is getting at. So continuing on here with some guidance. What are we supposed to do? Well, make a reasonable effort to cover all relevant issues when arriving at an investment recommendation or taking action, those types of things. This word "all," of course, is difficult. So make a reasonable reasonable effort to cover all relevant issues. I'm going to tell you that for walking around purposes, we could have a difference of opinion, but this word "all," you're going to have a high standard associated with that for the exam. So, of course, there is the idea of reasonableness, things you can't foresee, and if you're studying the microchip industry, do you really have to understand how yak milk production is going to impact that? Well, I don't know where we draw the line at all relevant issues, but for exam purposes, have a very high standard of that with regard to this. So the level of diligence, of course, is going to depend on the product or service offered. So there's another caveat there. This would make it seem like it was creating some safe harbor to me, but once again, I think that this is going to be the guiding principle that you need to make sure that you've got down for the exam. Continuing on with some more guidance. So what do we see here? Well, what about secondary or third-party research? So we are making recommendations. We're relying on something that someone else has said, written, some research that they've published. Okay, well, we have to determine the soundness of the research. That means we have to review its assumptions, its rigor, its timeliness. Is that research done in an independent nature? Okay, so whoever was producing that, do they have some sort of covert agenda that we need to be worried about? Well, if they do, then we've got to make sure that we know that and that we take that into consideration. The firm should be encouraged to adopt a policy of periodic review of the quality of third-party research. So, regarding, of course, these same things: assumptions, timeliness, rigor, objectivity, independence. So we need to have a way to assess whether or not we are being diligent in evaluating the quality of third-party research. So if the fact that someone has said something about, let's say, a particular firm, okay, we take that and we use it even if we disclose it. So I say, oh, well, there's this other research report that it says this is going to happen with market share, and we use that in our analysis with proper disclosure. That still does not relieve us from the burden of assessing the quality of the third-party research. So we've got to be really careful with that. What about recommended procedures? And so here we need to establish a policy that research and recommendation should have reasonable and adequate basis. Of course, this is a recommended procedure, the policy. Okay, the principle, though, is at play whether the policy is there or not. Okay, we need to be able to review or approve research reports and recommendations prior to external circulation, so it's a lot easier to take something back before it's actually distributed to the public than it is to take it back after it's already out there. So we need a way to review those statements before they are circulated to external constituency. Some more recommended procedure stuff. I have a couple of more slides on this, in fact. Establish due diligence procedures for judging if recommendations have met a reasonable and adequate basis criteria. So how are we going to go about doing the due diligence? The material here does not speak to the procedure itself, but it does say that as a recommended procedure, firms and members should have an established due diligence procedure for how we would go about that, and develop measurable criteria for assessing the quality of research. This measurability thing, of course, is hard, and there's a number of ways to approach that. And we'll see some of those as we progress through the curriculum towards level 3, but the measurable criteria thing, we don't receive any guidance on what it is in the curriculum, but you'll see this in a couple of places. We are supposed to have some sort of measurable criteria. So and on the exam, it will have to be something that makes good economic sense in order to determine whether a firm is in compliance with this particular standard. So, so like I said, there's a high standard for what's going on, and there are some vagaries here, but we're going to have to deal with that on the exam. That's why this material is difficult. All right, and finally, to finish up Standard 5A here, some more recommended procedures. We need to consider scenarios outside recent experience to assess the downside risk of quantitative models. Okay, so it's interesting that the ethics material from which this that we're responsible for now and from which this slideshow comes from, or this video series comes from, is based on the 2010 ethics book, the book that came out in 2010. I don't know what edition it is. It probably says at the beginning of the slides. Anyway, so it's of course the one that is currently embedded in the curriculum. If you think back a little ways to the start of the meltdown in 2008, well, we had all these models, and the models tested a range of outcomes basically that were within our experience. So in other words, we had looked at how wide the swings on prices could be or default rates could be and those types of things. This says that it's an ethical responsibility to use scenario analysis or sensitivity analysis. I guess this would imply perhaps scenario analysis, but to consider the idea that what is observable is not all that is possible. So hindsight here is 2020. Sure would have been nice to be one who was predicting that the quantitative models were inadequate long about 2007, because there was the people that did sure made a lot of scratch, a lot of money in 2008, 2009. Anyway, so we need to consider something outside of the observable recent experience is what this is saying. Make sure the firm has procedures to evaluate external advisors that they use or that they're promoting, and how often they're going to go and review those. Well, that's something that's going to be required under the diligence and reasonable basis standards. Let's move on to 5B. Which is going to deal, no, we have one more slide here, sorry. So we've got some written procedures of acceptable scenarios, scenario testing, range of scenarios, cash flow sensitivity to assumptions and inputs. So this is more of what we were just talking about as the first bullet point on the last slide. So we got to have procedures. They ought to be in writing. How are we going to go about developing scenarios, and how are we going to develop the range that we're going to use for those scenarios, and then how are we going to test test them in terms of cash flow sensitivity. All of this is really good stuff. And of course here it's stated in very general terms for the ethical implications. But from an economic implication, this is a really fascinating topic as to how to go about doing this. And of course, if you ever want to be a risk manager or if you want to avoid having your personal net worth destroyed in some sort of market downturn, this is a really good thing to do. We ought to have procedures for evaluating outside information providers, including how often we're going to do that. And there may be times when there is group research that we don't agree with. So we're part of a committee. That committee is making recommendations. There's 6 people on that. We're one of the 6, and the 6 are saying, or 5 of those 6 are saying we think this is a buy, and you think it is a sell. Well, what does that mean? We talked about dissociation previously from unethical behavior. Well, if you really believe it's a sell and everyone else is saying it's a buy, do you have to dissociate? Well, in fact, you do not, as long as the people that are saying buy aren't doing that for some unethical reason. There are differences of opinion. In this case, you were the minority opinion, but everyone had supported their case with research and facts. Well, there's no need to dissociate just because you are a dissenting opinion, but there does need to be a basis, a reasonable and adequate basis for the majority opinion. Otherwise, there could be a need for dissociation, so keep that in mind. All right, and that brings us now to, with something of a false start a moment ago, to Standard 5B on communication with clients and prospective clients. So here, where again, anytime you're dealing with clients or prospective clients, that ought to throw up red flags for you in terms of testable material. So we're very concerned about how we deal with clients, how we protect their interests, the communication that we have with them. We want all that to be fair, adequate, complete, fair, accurate, and complete, all those types of things. So this is something I would pay special note to. And in fact, you'll see this is one of the long standards. It's got takes us 3 slides just to get through the standard itself. But nonetheless, this is something that does contain lots of testable material. So what is it that we're supposed to do here under the standard? Well, we're supposed to disclose the basic format or general principles of the investment processes used to analyze investments, select securities, construct portfolios, all that type of thing. So if to the extent that we have some sort of proprietary models that we're going about using, we don't have to we don't have to reveal all that to the competition, but we do have to say how we are doing this. So generally what sort of quantitative procedures are we using, what are we looking for, are we a value portfolio, how do we determine what value is, those types of things. And once we have disclosed these basic formats, general principles, we need to promptly disclose any changes that are going to have some sort of material impact on our process. So we've been doing something one way and we've been doing it and it's been successful. We're getting ready to tweak that in some material fashion. Then we need to make sure that that is promptly disclosed to all of our clients. Continuing on with the standard here, so we need to use reasonable judgment in identifying which factors are important to an investment analysis, recommendation, or action. So reasonable judgment, again, that's those are hard terms to deal with. I would assess a high standard, meaning that if you think, is this something that needs to be identified as an important factor? Well, yes, it does. If you have any ambiguity in your thought, then certainly it should be. Include those factors in communication. So once we identify the factors up here, okay, we've got to include those factors when we are communicating with our clients or prospective clients. And finally, to finish up the standard itself, then we can move on to the guidance. We need to distinguish between fact and opinion. Okay, this is actually a pretty big deal, I think, in the curriculum. So it's fine to say that your forecasts show sales will increase by 8% next year. Okay? It's something else to say that sales will increase by 8% next year. So one of those was an opinion. It was an opinion based on, supported by a reasonable basis. You've done some forecasting, all those types of things. So it's fine to give opinions. So, of course, there needs to be reasonable basis, but it's fine to give opinions, but you can't state opinions as if they were fact. So make sure that we're separating out those two things and that they're clearly delineated, and if that's the case, then you're going to be, or the scenario that's described on the exam will be within the standards set here in the ethics material. So we need to clearly communicate potential gains and losses of an investment. So this is going to be something where we'll see the words effective communication and effective disclosure later on, but when we're looking at something like an IO strip, so an interest-only strip, well, of course, the amount of the cash flows in an IO strip are not guaranteed. Now, if you don't know what an IO strip is, don't worry, before you're responsible for it, we'll go over that. But anyway, the point is that if you look at some sort of mortgage-backed security, you got a principal side, you got an interest side. The principal amount is guaranteed, assuming that these are all Ginnie Mae type securities. The principal amount is guaranteed by the United States government. The interest amount is not. Okay? If you are communicating that the interest would be that the cash flows are guaranteed by the U.S. government, well, in the sense that the interest will be paid, I guess that is true, but the amount of the interest is not certain because it depends on the amount of outstanding principal. Well, then you're going to have to be careful with that. So communicating potential gains and potential losses of an investment, and it's going to have to be in a way that doesn't obfuscate or obscure the true nature of the security. All right, so some guidance here. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to include the basic characteristics of a security in our discussion. Now remember, previously when we talked about communication with clients, we had the admonition to consider the sophistication of the client. I don't think that has changed. So in other words, if we're presenting to a group of mutual fund managers, talking about what an equity security is may not be required. So we still have to think in terms of sophistication of our clients, but be careful using that on the exam. Remember my scenario, I always start from the position of a money manager dealing with an unsophisticated client, and then I build out from there and say, is there anything here that would make this relationship different? Anyway, we need to communicate the basic characteristics. We need to inform clients of any change in our investment process. So if we're changing the way we do things, we've got to tell clients about it. Okay, suitability, remember that was my third axiom, okay, and suitability is always going to be considered in a portfolio context. We'll talk about that a little more also, but the suitability for the client is going to be important, and it's going to depend on their needs and their existing portfolio, so fairly high standard there. And this, of course, covers all communication, not just a formal report. This would be oral communication, emails, all those types of things would also be included here. What about recommended procedures? So recommended procedures, so here we need the inclusion or exclusion of information depends on a case-by-case review. So what is that telling us? Again, we're communicating with clients. What are the factors that are going to be important? What is the sophistication level of the client? Well, in order to determine what we're going to present, that's going to require case-by-case review. So there is room here for the analyst to use judgment. And of course, we need to maintain records about what we say. So we need to be able to go in and document that, yes, we've had this communication. Yes, we asserted these opinions. We need to be able to back that up with the records that we use to develop those opinions. And we have more to say about that in Standard 5C, which deals directly with record retention. Now, if you go back a few generations in the ethics material, this is something that came in as an independent standard, 5C, and you got to go back a couple of generations to get to what I'm about to talk about. But I was so glad to see it come in as its own standard here, 5C, because it used to be the last item on every standard. So every time you had something about communication, every time you had something about research, every time you had something about suitability, then the last thing they had to say was, oh yeah, keep records. So what they essentially did was pull all that out and put it into its own standard here. So we only have to talk about it once is what it amounts to. Anyway, record retention. What does this say? Well, we got to develop and maintain appropriate records to support what we're doing. So we're making investment analysis recommendations, we're taking actions, so we are advising clients, all those types of things. Well, we are responsible as a discipline for having records to support the decisions that we come to. So the decision itself can be right or wrong. Of course, we have to be independent and we have to have loyalty when we're making the decision, but the decision itself can be right or wrong, but whatever way it goes in the future, we have to have supporting documentation for that. So guidance here. We're going to maintain records to support our research, okay, and the rationale for the conclusions and actions. Okay, records, and this goes back to our discussion about the committee that developed this and who was on it and all that sort of thing in terms of our responsibilities to employers. But remember, records are the firm's property, and if you leave a firm, you can't take those records with you. So the records that you maintain as part of your daily activities, so you're going to work, you're scouring research reports, you're downloading information, you're coming up with investment recommendations, you're creating files to support those recommendations so that if ever called to, you can show how you came to that conclusion. Well, those files are the firm's property and you can't take them when you leave. Okay? In the absence of other regulatory requirements, CFAI is going to recommend a retention period of 7 years for these records. So if you've got file cabinets full of stuff and they are 9 or 10 years old and you work in a jurisdiction that doesn't require you to keep them, doesn't have a specific period, well, maybe you can start throwing some of that away and clean out that messy office that you have. All right, so some recommended procedures here. Responsibility to maintain records generally falls to the firm. So this is really a firm responsibility, although it is your responsibility to comply with the firm's policies. So the individuals have to retain documents to support investment-related communication. They belong to the firm. It's the firm's responsibility to make sure it's done, but you are responsible for being in compliance with that. Now, what about when you leave the firm? Okay, well, if you're going to leave the firm, then you have to recreate the records from public sources. Okay, or from the new firm's information. So if ever called on to support your investment analyses recommendations, you can't rely on material from your old firm or on your own memory. Okay, under the code and standards, you would be required to take information at your new firm and then public sources in order to recreate the data. So the old firm isn't responsible for supporting your record retention after you leave, is what this amounts to. All right, and that gets us through Standard 5, which brings us, of course, to Standard 6, conflict of interest. Okay, there's a couple of good things about this. One, it's relatively interesting. Two, it solves some of the problems and conundrums that we come up with previously in the other standards. And three, it's the last of what I would call the fundamental standards or economically based standards, because when the next one is Standard 7, Standards 1 through 6 apply to everybody. So it doesn't matter if you're working in the industry, you may or may not have specifically committed yourself to comply with this particular code and standards, but the idea behind them is these standards would constitute ethical behavior for all individuals in our discipline. The next one, Standard 7, only applies to those of us crazy enough to sign up for the CFA exams or to join CFAI. And of course, I'm kidding when I say you're crazy. Remember, I'm a big fan. All right? Okay, so again, and I'm going to try to stop saying this because you're probably getting sick of it, but remember, independence, loyalty, okay, diligence, reasonable basis, suitability, those are the pillars. And then we have conflicts of interest, which we go back and we say, well, what if there were some problems with these other things? How can we cure that? And that's what we're going to see here in conflicts of interest. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about disclosure. And this is a huge, huge deal on the exam. So if there's, especially as it relates to your independence and loyalty, okay, if there are any potential problems there, disclosure is going to be the cure for that. So we need to make full, fair disclosure, full and fair, those are the operative words, of all matters. Okay, well that again, that's a pretty big word for only having 3 letters. All matters that could reasonably be expected to impair independence, objectivity, or interfere with duty to clients, prospects, or employers. Okay, so again, the problem here is how to interpret this. How broadly do we interpret what needs to be disclosed? And here's the joke I use. All right, so if you're doing anything other than serving as the assistant coach on your daughter's soccer team, okay, you don't have to disclose that. but anything that would be more material than being the assistant coach on your daughter's soccer team, that probably needs to be disclosed. So if you get, if you're from assistant coach, you get promoted to head coach, you're probably going to have to say something about that. And of course, I mentioned that facetiously. But on the exam, if you're wondering, should this have been disclosed or should it not be disclosed, or does it have to be disclosed, not have to be disclosed? Okay, well then it has to be disclosed. Interpret this very, very broadly. That's and there may be room in the real world to talk about what is full and fair and all those types of things, but on the exam, interpret this word or these words, all matters, very broadly. Okay, and this is something that came in a couple of generations ago in the ethics material that I really like, and that is that the disclosures have to be prominent. Okay, so it can't be something that's buried in the footnotes at the back, and deliver it in plain language. So if it starts out, the party of the first part with respect to the paradigm of the, whatever, it goes on, okay, so it's obfuscated by the language used, then it's also not going to be adequate. So we have to have prominent disclosure and in in plain language. That's what the standard is telling us. What about some guidance on this? Okay, so here, first let's talk about disclosure to clients, okay, and then we can go and talk about disclosure to employers. So all matters that could impair objectivity, okay, what we're trying to do is allow the client to judge our motives and our potential biases. So if we're making decisions, we serve on the board of some company, we're compensated for our service there, we're also recommending are recommending to our clients that they buy the stock in that company. Well, if we disclose prominently, we disclose in plain language what we're doing. Well, then the client is able to judge the motives and any inherent biases there. So if we're looking for some examples, well, we can have disclosure between the member of the firm and an issuer. So if there's a relationship there, investment banking relationships would probably need to be disclosed. Well, they would need to be disclosed. Broker, dealer, or market making activities. So if we're making a market in securities, we need to disclose that. Significant stock ownership, of course, this is a big deal. So if you personally own a lot of stock in a particular company, you're writing research reports in that industry, well, you would probably want to disclose that. Board service, that was the example I used just a moment ago. So anyway, those are all things that would need to be disclosed. What about, so this was disclosed to clients, what about disclosed to employers? And so if we're disclosing to employers, okay, well, conflict of interest. So if we, again, stock ownership, if we own stock in a company that we are analyzing or making recommendations on, we're participating in the board, or if we have financial or other pressures that may influence our decisions, we need to disclose that to our employer. At the bottom, this also covers conflicts that could be damaging to the employer's business. So if there's something that would be bad press for the employer, well, we have to let them know what's going on with that. Moving on to recommended procedures here. Looking at what it is that we're recommended to do with respect to disclosure, we need to disclose all compensation arrangements with the employer that conflict with the client's interest. Okay, if the firm doesn't permit disclosure, then we may have to dissociate. So this is something of a problem, and you see this if you read firms' literature that they distribute broadly. We've seen a growth in the sort of disclosure stuff about compensation of equity analysts. So they'll say some sort of statement about how equity analysts are compensated in research reports and those types of things. So we need to one, make sure that there is no conflict between the compensation scheme and the client. But if there is any potential conflict, we need to make sure it's disclosed. Okay? And if the firm doesn't allow disclosure, then maybe that's not a firm that we should be working with. So firms are encouraged to include compensation information in promotional materials. Well, that's what we were just talking about. So where are we at now? Okay, sorry, lost my place there. All right, so but now we are looking at standard 6B, priority of transactions. We started talking about priority of transactions way back when we were back in the Code of Ethics. So we've seen the same theme go through. Well, there's nothing that's really going to change here. We're just going to flesh that out just a little bit. So looking at this, so the standard itself, investment transactions for clients and employers have to have priority over the transactions in which a member or the candidate is a beneficial owner. And we'll talk about that word beneficial owner in just a moment. But what does this say? Well, basically, okay, before you can trade, you have to give your clients a chance to trade, and you have to give the firm a chance to trade. So we can't use knowledge of pending trades for personal gains, front running, that type of thing. Obviously, that would be unethical. Some guidance here. So beneficial owner, what does that mean? Well, basically the idea is that we have direct or indirect personal interest. So I actually can't remember if this was a test question or if it was a practice question I did, but I remember the scenario, and I think I was preparing for level 2 when there was a broker at one place, or a research analyst working at one shop, and he opened a brokerage account in his spouse's name at another brokerage so that he could trade. Well, you know, legally, I suppose he didn't own those securities, but he was obviously a beneficial owner. So again, and related to all of our discussion here, there is always the purpose or the idea of intent. So if the intent of the actions or the statements of the players in the scenarios on the exam is to circumvent what we're trying to get at with the Code of Ethics and the Standards of Professional Conduct, then there is a violation. So it doesn't matter whether you own the securities or you're executing the trade for your account or your brother's account or your mother's account or anything else, okay, then you have to be in compliance, and you have to give, they have to give the clients and the employer priority. And that, of course, is the second bullet point. Clients and employer transactions take priority. What about family member accounts? Well, family member accounts, this is a great caveat. And so you've got 20 accounts. One of them is Aunt Ruth. So maybe what you can do is you can always trade for Aunt Ruth's account last, so that there's no appearance of evil. Well, that certainly sounds like it's a good control mechanism, someone who's really going out of their way to avoid even the appearance of evil. The problem with that is you are, you're discriminating against Aunt Ruth. Okay, so family member accounts that are client accounts must be treated as other accounts. You can't advantage them, but you also can't disadvantage them. So keep that in mind. We can't, we don't have to ruin our parents' retirement if we're managing their accounts, those types of things. Okay, so going on with recommended procedures. Okay, so the firm's compliance procedures need to limit participation in equity IPOs. So, who's getting those shares? We'll talk more later in the curriculum about the allocation process for those, and restrict purchase of securities that are purchased through private placements. So those are specifically mentioned as danger areas where the firm needs to exercise particular diligence in ensuring that there's no unethical activities there. Okay, what about blackout or restricted periods? Of course, when we are making recommendations, or those recommendations are being distributed, or while we are holding sensitive financial information, we need to have blackout or restricted periods for trading. Okay, we need to establish reporting procedures and prior clearance requirements. So the firm should have some sort of mechanism for the employees reporting their trades or getting prior clearance if it's a particularly sensitive trade, and then disclose policies on personal investing to clients upon request. So we need some sort, if we can disclose these policies, well, we need the policies to begin with, right? So if it comes to the point where a client asks for those, I've always wondered how often it is that a client, before there's a problem, comes and asks for those. That's probably something that happens a lot after there's a problem. But nonetheless, I always wondered how many clients go in and say, well, I'd like to see your policies on personal investing. I'm going to do that one time. I'm going to call up some big brokerage house and ask them for their policies and see what they say. All right, so anyway, that gets us past Standard 6B and brings us to Standard 6C on referral fees. So again, knocking through this stuff, we're not very far away from the end of the Standards of Professional Conduct. Hang in there with me. All right, so referral fees. What does this say? Well, again, this is a disclosure element. Disclose to employer, client, and prospective clients as appropriate any compensation that we're going to receive from others for recommending their product or services. So we're talking about either receiving a referral fee, so we have a client, we refer them to someplace else for some insurance, okay, or someone else is we're paying someone else to refer their clients to us, Either way, those referral fees have to be disclosed. That's something that we need to, that's something that the investor or the client or the employer will want to know so that they can evaluate any potential biases. So disclosure allows the clients and employers to evaluate the full cost of any service and the potential biases embedded in that. So again, this is information that the typical client in particular would want to know, and employers, of course, are, we go back to our responsibility to employers, where we essentially said the same thing. Disclosure is to be made prior to entering into any formal agreements. So we can't enter into a formal agreement to receive referral fees and then notify our clients. We've got to notify them, and then we can enter into the agreement. And of course, we need to disclose the nature of the compensation. So is this going to be cash, or is it going to be something else? So there's some guidance on that standard. Some more stuff here that we need to know. Encourage firms to have a clear policy regarding referral compensation. Firms that do not prohibit referral fees should have a clear approval process. So many firms just prohibit that. We can't pay them, and in particular, we can't receive them. Okay? But if they don't prohibit it, they ought to have some sort of mechanism in place where they can, in fact, have a process that will approve this particular relationship. And members should update referral compensation disclosure to the employer at least quarterly. So we see again a time standard there. And that brings us to the end of what I would refer to previously as the fundamental or the economic-based standards, and brings us to the final standard in this code and standards. This is the one we've been looking for, and this is the responsibilities that we as members of CFAI or CFAI candidates take upon ourselves. So when you signed up to take level 1, you had to fill out all that paperwork, and you went through and you signed all that stuff. Well, you have, as part of that, I'm hoping you were reading it as you were going through, but one of the things you did when you went through there was you obligated yourself to comply with the code and standards. So there's really two reasons to study the ethics material here, right? One is that it's going to be 15% of this level 1 exam, okay? But the other is you've obligated yourself to comply with these, and if you're going to be obligated to comply, it sure would be nice to know what it is that you're complying with. So now we're going to tell you, now that you've already committed to it. All right, so what does this say? Hey, so conduct as members and candidates in the CFA program. Well, we can't engage in any conduct that compromises the reputation or integrity of the institute or the designation. So remember, CFAI rightly is the watchdog of the reputation of CFAI itself and the CFA designation. So eventually here, maybe 30 months or 36 months from now, depending on where you are in your study patterns, you are going to have a CFA charter. Let's think positive. Well, you would be very upset if you labored for several years, put in lots of work, went through all the pain required, and then CFAI let people go out and run down the value of the designation. So we've got to make sure that we're not engaging in any conduct that compromises the reputation or integrity of our CFA charter or the integrity, validity, or security of the CFA examinations. So we've got the examinations are specifically mentioned, and of course we're very worried. They're very worried. I don't know if worried is maybe not the right word. They're very serious about security on the CFA exams. So what does this mean in terms of our guidance? Well, this includes things like cheating on the exams. Okay, so you're not supposed to cheat on the CFA exams. We've got it right here in writing. Okay, disregarding rules and policies or security measures related to the exam. This is, even if you weren't cheating, what are you bringing in with you and how are you approaching the exam, those types of things, all that's going to be important. Giving confidential information to candidates or the public. Confidential information, essentially, when you go in and sit down for the exam, okay, you are receiving confidential information. That is the contents of the exam, and you are not to give that out to the general public. So you can't disclose the formulas tested or not tested on the exam, specific question information, or topic emphasis on the exam or topic topics tested. Now, when you, as you listen to me go through or whoever is going through a particular topic area, fixed income or equity or quant method stuff, then I'm going to tell you, oh, this is something that is central to your understanding and has lots of fingers and reaches out and touches other things. Therefore, it's going to be something important, and it's something that's likely been tested a lot just because it is central and because you have to know this to know so many other things. Okay, what we won't do, of course, is tell you this was tested this was tested this way in 2007 and those types of things. One, we don't know that, and two, we would be violating the code of ethics if we did. I am proud to tell you that one of the reasons I really like working with Schweizer is because they are a very ethical company. So what about conducting some more conduct here? Okay, improper use of the CFA designation to further our personal and professional objectives. Now remember the word improper here. So there's a proper use, right? So the CFA designation says something about you. It says that you have, primarily gone through these 3 exams and suffered through the rigor of that. You've learned something doing it, but there's also an attestation of your character and those types of things. It's fine to use the CFA designation in proper ways. Okay, what it's not fine to do is use it in improper ways to say, oh, I have a CFA, therefore I can always beat the market and I'm much better looking than the people around me. Okay, so we've got to be careful about that. Misrepresenting the CFA Institute Professional Development Program or Professional Conduct Statement. Okay, so we can't lie when we do our PCS. So every year after you get your charter, you're going to have to go in and sign your PCS, Professional Conduct Statement, and basically what you're saying is I'm still a good person, I haven't been lying, cheating, and stealing all year long. Also, the Professional Development Program, this is effectively the voluntary continuing ed arm of CFAI, so you'll get a chance to say, well, have you complied with these standards? And I do this, of course, every year, and I always have complied with the standards, but I'm a researcher at a university, so I'm always thinking about and doing these sorts of things, but I have to go back and say, well, I'm supposed to spend so many hours doing this and something on ethics and those types of things, and I usually am someone who can say, yes, I've completed that, and then they sometimes send me a certificate, although I don't recall getting one last year now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, all right, so what about Part B here? So reference to the CFA Institute, CFA designation, and CFA program. When referring to the institute, membership, or designation or candidacy, do not misrepresent or exaggerate the meaning or implications of the membership or holding the CFA, those types of things. So it has a certain meaning. Okay, we can always make factual statements. Okay, but we can't say that this is something that means that I am more likely to beat the market than someone else or something along those lines. Okay, so what are other requirements here? Okay, well, of course, if you are a member, you have to complete your PCS, Professional Conduct Statement, annually, and they for some reason seem to be very interested in me paying my dues annually. There's one year that I got the notice and I couldn't get into the website to do it and kind of forgot about it, and I ended up getting, I think, 2 or 3 notices in a letter saying, we sure want you to pay your dues. So they were pretty much Johnny on the spot for that. Anyway, wonder why that is. So what about failure to comply with either of these? Okay, if you're not, so you've gone all the way through, you've gotten your certificate, you hung your diploma on the wall, you're a CFA charter holder, okay, well, you still have to pay your dues, you still have to complete your PCS, it only takes a minute, but failure to comply with that means that you're going to be on inactive status, and inactive status means that you don't get to use the designation on your business card. Okay, so what about some more guidance here using the marks? Chartered Financial Analyst, or CFA. Again, we cannot misrepresent or exaggerate the meaning, so we have to use those. We can use them after your name, or you can use them as a adjective, which we'll see here in a minute. So we got to be careful. There used to be, and I actually don't even know if it's still in this version, but let's say it is. Notice the idea that the CFA that comes after your name on your business card had to be in the same size font. So you couldn't have, you know, Andrew Holmes and CFA and, you know, flashing red lights or anything like that. So it had to be, has to use it in a dignified and appropriate manner. Okay, so candidates may reference their participation in the CFA program, but can't imply any sort of partial designation. So in other words, when you get past this level 1 exam, you're not going to be able to say that you are a level 1 CFA. You can say, I have passed the level 1 examination. That is a factual statement, so that's fine, but you can't imply any sort of partial designation. Once you get past level 1 and you register for level 2, you can say that you are a level 2 candidate, okay, but again, no partial designation. Okay. I happen to be someone who passed all the exams on their first attempt, which I'm sure should, if it had taken me 12 tries to get through the 3 exams, that probably wouldn't bode very well for my ability to host these videos. But nonetheless, that would be a statement that I could make on my resume if I wanted to. So I passed all 3 levels of the exam on my first attempt. So a 3 up, 3 down, you hear people talk about that. They were a 3 up, 3 down guy. Anyway, but nonetheless, that's a factual statement. What I can't say is, because I passed on the first time, I'm smarter than everybody else. Okay, so I can't apply any superior ability or those types of things. So basically, factual statements okay, non-factual statements not okay. All right. So anyway, we have to use the CFA or the Chartered Financial Analyst, okay, either after our names or as an adjective. So I have been very careful, and you may or may not have noticed this as we've gone through this ethics material. I've always talked about the CFA charter or a CFA charter holder. What I have not done is, at least I hope not, and I may have slipped up because this is what I actually do in real life, and I shouldn't. Okay, but anyway, I talk about someone being a CFA. Oh, he's a CFA. I'm a CFA. I'm not a CFA. Okay, that is not appropriate use of those marks or of that term. That would be using them as a noun, right? So you have to use it as an adjective. So I am a CFA charter holder. Okay, or, so you can put CFA after your name. Okay, that's the typical way we present professional designations or credentials. Okay, but other than that, you have to use it as an adjective. And the last slide in this code and standards, still have the stub material to get through, but to finally get through the code and standards here. In terms of recommended procedures, we are supposed to make sure that the employer is aware of the proper references to the CFA designation and CFA candidacy. So we would want our employers to know that when they were advertised in their promotional materials, that all of our analysts are CFA charter holders. They're not all CFAs and those types of things. So the employers need to be made aware of how to reference the designation, what it means, and those types of things. And that is the code and standards. Fairly long, but I think this is the core of the material, and it's going to be the core of the material at all 3 levels. So this is worth spending some time going back through. You will be responsible for it on the exam. This is certainly material we know is going to show up. So make sure and spend some time going through the code and standards book, underlining, reading their little vignettes about, sort of like mini cases, sometimes only 3 or 5 sentences, because that's going to help you build lots of intuition about how to apply these many different concepts on the exam itself.